Good evening, everyone. I am going to start today's lesson with a reading. It is a folk tale from India about an elephant, and it illustrates how we all have different perspectives on things and how different perspectives can lead to different points of view and different sorts of beliefs. So I will jump right into it. Called The Blind Men and the Elephant. That's a folk tale from India. Long ago, 6 old men lived in a village in India. Each was born blind. The other villagers loved the old men and kept them away from harm. Since the blind men could not see the world for themselves, they had to imagine many of its wonders. They listened carefully to the stories told by travelers to learn what they could about life outside the village. The men were curious about many of the stories they heard, but they were most curious about elephants. They were told elephants could trample forests, carry huge burdens, and frighten young and old with their loud trumpet calls. But they also knew that the Raja's daughter rode an elephant when she traveled in her father's kingdom. Would the Raja let his daughter get so near such a dangerous creature? The old men argued day and night about elephants. An elephant must be a powerful giant, claimed the first blind man. He had heard stories about elephants being used to clear forests and build roads. No, you must be wrong, argued the second blind man. An elephant must be graceful and gentle if a princess is to ride on its back. You're wrong. I have heard that an elephant can pierce a man's heart with its terrible horns, said the third blind man. Please, said the fourth. You're all mistaken. An elephant is nothing more than a large sort of cow. You know how people exaggerate. I'm sure an elephant is something magical, said another. That would explain why the Raja's daughter could travel safely throughout the kingdom. I don't believe elephants exist at all, declared the sixth blind man. I think we are the victims of a cruel joke. Finally, the villagers grew tired of all the arguments, and they arranged for the curious men to visit the palace of the Raja to learn the truth about elephants. A young boy from their village was selected to guide the blind men on their journey. The smallest man put his head on the boy's shoulder. The second blind man put his head on his friend's shoulder, and so on until all 6 men were ready to walk safely behind the boy who would lead them to the Raja's magnificent palace. When the blind men reached the palace, they were greeted by an old friend from their village who worked as a gardener on the palace grounds. Their friend led them to the courtyard. There stood an elephant. The blind men stepped forward to touch the creature that was the subject of so many arguments. The first blind man reached out and touched the side of the huge animal. An elephant is smooth and solid like a wall, he declared. It must be very powerful. But the second man put his hand on the elephant's limber trunk. He said, oh, an elephant is like a giant snake. The third blind man felt the elephant's pointed tusk. I was right, he decided. This creature is as sharp and deadly as a spear. The fourth blind man touched one of the elephant's 4 legs. What we have here, he said, is an extremely large cow. The fifth blind man felt the elephant's giant ear. I believe an elephant is like a huge fan or maybe a magic carpet that can fly over mountains and treetops, he said. The sixth blind man gave a tug on the elephant's coarse tail. Why, this is nothing more than a piece of old rope. Dangerous indeed, he scoffed. The gardener led his friends to the shade of a tree. Sit here and rest for the long journey home, he said. I will bring you some water to drink. While they waited, the sixth blind man talked about the elephant. An elephant is like a wall, said the first blind man. Surely we can finally agree on that. A wall? The elephant is a giant snake, said the man who had felt the elephant's tusk. It's a spear, I tell you, said another. I'm certain it's a giant cow, said the fourth. Magic carpet, there's no doubt. Don't you see, pleaded the sixth blind man. Someone used a rope to trick us. Their argument continued, and their shouts grew louder and louder. Wall, snake, spear, cow, carpet, rope. Stop shouting, called a very angry voice. It was the Raja, awakened from his nap by the noisy argument. How could each of you be so certain you were right? Asked the ruler. The sixth blind man considered the question, and then, Knowing the Raja to be a very wise man, they decided to say nothing at all. The elephant is a very large animal, said the Raja clearly. Each man touched only one part. Perhaps if you put all the parts together, you will see the truth. Now let me finish my nap in peace. When their friend returned to the garden with the cool water, the 6 men rested quietly in the shade, thinking about the Raja's advice. He's right, said the first blind man. To learn the truth, we must put all the parts together. Let's discuss this on the journey home. And that is the story of the blind man and the elephant. So you can understand how they got so confused and were arguing with each other, right? Because they were all just looking at one little piece of the elephant. They all had a very narrow view instead of looking at the whole picture, because that's all they could see in front of them or see with their hands, right? They were feeling it. So they only had that one certain little view and they couldn't see the rest. They couldn't see the bigger picture because of that. So this is very much how we all are, right? We all have certain worldviews, right? We're taught certain things. We live among the same type of people, and we sort of tend to, it's easier to be around people who are similar to us and think the same that way that we are. So often it's easy to forget that there's all these other people out there that have different beliefs, right? Other parts of the elephant. And especially in this last year, there's been a lot of division among people in this country. And for myself, sometimes it's really hard to understand, how can this person possibly think what they think, right? It's like, it just doesn't make sense to me. How can I just don't understand it. It seems so wrong in my eyes, because I'm seeing maybe the ears of the elephant. But this person, they grew up in a different place, they were raised differently, they're surrounded by different people. They're maybe feeling the trunk of the elephant, and they have a different way of seeing things. So it's really important to not look so narrowly that we're just seeing our own points of view, but to try to look more broadly and consider what other people might be seeing that is leading them to have a different view than you do, right? Because if you feel the trunk, yes, of course, the elephant, of course, you're going to think that's a snake. So you're given a certain perspective, and that's going to make you think very differently about things than compared to someone who was the blind man who felt the ear. Of course, he thought it was the elephant was more like a magic carpet, right? He based that belief on what he was seeing, but he wasn't seeing the full picture. And sometimes it's easy to just say, it's not easy to do, right? It's really hard. And it's a lot easier to just say, oh, that person is wrong, in order to look a little closely about why they might think what they think. And when we start looking at, talking with those people and seeing why they have those thoughts and why they have those beliefs, maybe they aren't entirely right in what they're thinking, but you know what? We probably aren't entirely right either, because in what we think, because we have these narrow views. And there's always, it's natural. We always all have a certain perspective based on where we've come from, and it's impossible not to. But if we are able to talk with others and try to look at all the different parts of the elephant, so all the reasons other people might have different beliefs, and try to come to an understanding, then you're closer to the truth of what that elephant actually is, right? So if these blind men all shared with each other what they felt when they were feeling the elephant, they can get the larger picture and see the larger truth. Now, this is very similar to some of Jesus' teachings, right? Because he says, love your enemies, right? So these people that think very differently than you, and you may think are entirely wrong and hard to understand where they're coming from, Jesus says, embrace them, right? So I'm going to read from, it is from Matthew. Let's see. It is Matthew chapter 5, verse 43. He says, you have heard that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who harass you, so that you will be acting as children of God who is in heaven. God makes the sun rise on both the evil and the good, and sends rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous. If you only love those who love you, What reward do you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing? Don't even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, just as God is complete in showing love to everyone, so also must you be complete. Now, Martin Luther King had some really wonderful things to say about this passage in a speech that he gave. So I am going to read that to you. And lots of reading from things today. So this was a speech that Martin Luther King developed at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, November of 1957. And he says, so now this is what Martin Luther King said in his speech. So I want to turn your attention to this subject, loving your enemies. It's so basic to me because it is part of my basic philosophical and theological orientation. The whole idea of love, the philosophy of love. In the 5th chapter of the Gospel, as recorded by Matthew, we read these lines: "Ye have heard that it is said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemies." Certainly, these great words. Certainly, these are great words. And over the centuries, many persons have argued that this is an extremely difficult command, which is, right? We talked about that. Many would go so far as to say it just isn't possible to move out into the actual practice of this glorious command. They would go on to say that it's just additional proof that Jesus was an impractical idealist who never quite came down to earth. So the arguments abound. But far from being an impractical idealist, Jesus has become a practical realist. The words of this text glitter in our eyes. And this command is absolutely necessary for the survival of our civilization. Yes, it is love that will save our world and civilization, love even for enemies. And then he goes on to say, Jesus was very serious when he gave this command. He wasn't playing. He realized it's hard to love your enemies. He realized that it's difficult to love those persons who seek to defeat you, those persons who say evil things about you, who think differently than you. He realized that it was painfully hard. He wasn't playing. We cannot dismiss this passage as just an exaggeration. This is a basic philosophy of all that we hear coming from the lips of our master, because Jesus wasn't playing, he was serious. We have the Christian and moral responsibility to discover the meaning of these words and how we discover how we can live out this command and why we should live by this command to love our enemies. So I will leave you with Martin Luther King's words on the subject. And until next time, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and remember to consider the whole elephant.